A soft, reluctant sun lingers over Oxford, brushing the quad with half-hearted warmth. The kind of afternoon where silence carries more weight than conversation, and where a single envelope can alter the course of everything. Tonight, we step into a world of forgotten lectures, locked archives, and a scholar whose last words were written in red. This is not just a mystery. It is a story of how secrets whisper louder than screams. But before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Is it a quiet study, a dimly lit bedroom, a train ride through the dark? Wherever you are, remember, Oxford stones have heard stranger confessions than these. Let's begin. It was the sort of afternoon that made you believe the university might still mean something. The sun, rare and uncommitted, had spilled itself lazily across the Exeter quad, gilding the paving stones like an apology. Somewhere, perhaps in the chapel or the senior common room, a piano was being tuned with more hope than skill, and the air tasted faintly of cut grass and pencil shavings. I had no appointment, no intention, and no particular desire to be anywhere at all. The porter had offered me a nod, the sort that carries the weight of accumulated habit rather than recognition, and I stood a moment longer outside his lodge, pretending to read a notice about an upcoming poetry, reading I would, of course, never attend. There's a line in Houseman that returns to me on days like that. Something about the land of lost content, the lane you'll never walk again. It strikes harder when the light falls just so, touching old glass and older minds. Some memories wear the face of someone else's regret. A blackboard, visible through a cracked upper pane of the archive wing, still bore the phantom of a lecture. Greek, I thought, or mathematics. Something orderly. The chalk lines, faded and half erased, hovered there like a ghost reluctant to depart. I suppose I stood staring at it too long, because the sound of spinning wheels and a low curse broke the spell. A courier on a bicycle, slowing with theatrical impatience, gestured vaguely at his map. He asked, without ceremony, for Dr. Harriet Lencomb. Archive wing, he said. Something about a sealed envelope, didn't say from whom. I pointed him through the cloisters, and he pedalled off with that mixture of youthful arrogance and modern disinterest I've never quite learned to resent. Harriet Lencomb. The name was familiar in that Oxford way. Often read, rarely spoken. Romantic poetry, if memory served. Eliza Marr, specifically, though one suspected the scholar had fallen somewhat in love with the ghost she was studying. There had been a minor fuss some years ago, Harriet suggesting that Marr's demise wasn't accidental, the sort of academic tremor that shakes teacups but not foundations. I remembered thinking at the time that anyone who takes dead poets too seriously tends to meet them eventually. I wandered, slowly, as I always do when thought outweighs purpose. The flagstones still bore faint traces of last week's rain, and somewhere in the distance a church bell marked a time I wasn't keeping. A pigeon, grey with an iridescent collar like a forgotten medal, perched on the head of William Morris's statue, twitching as if even he wasn't quite sure who William Morris had been. I think I stood in that courtyard longer than I meant to. Not waiting exactly, just observing the way dust moves in sunlight. I remember the way it danced above the black iron grills of the archive windows. There is something curiously tragic about the stillness of old rooms, as though silence itself were once loud and has since been reprimanded. It was nearly evening when I heard the scream, a sharp, clean sound. Not hysterical, not prolonged. And then the hurried click of steps on wood. I was too far to see who had made it, and by the time I reached the staircase that wound up to the archive wing, the porter was already there, his keys trembling just slightly in the lock. She was found by a postgraduate, I would learn. A girl who had come to submit her final dissertation and found Harriet at her desk, very still, very red. The police would arrive shortly after. tape would be stretched, protocols muttered, gloves snapped on, but it was the envelope that held them. That damned envelope. I didn't see it until later. Not that night, but the story had already begun. The courier, the envelope, the dust, the cracked pane, all of it aligning itself into some quiet design, like letters slowly revealing a word in a crossword I'd yet to solve. I stood in the quad as the blue lights flickered against the old stone, and I thought, not for the first time, how very loud a secret can be once it finally decides to whisper. I turned to go. The sun had gone. The pigeon was gone. And though I couldn't prove it, I knew, I always know, that someone had sent that envelope knowing it would arrive too late. The office was smaller than I remembered, or perhaps grief has a way of collapsing space. I stood just inside the doorway while the constable muttered something procedural to Lewis, who had already begun his slow circuit round the perimeter of the room, like a man reading a silent clock. I said nothing. It was a scene that didn't require commentary. The dust was undisturbed, the books closed. No sign of violence if one didn't look too closely at the floor. She was curled, not fallen, slumped in a posture that felt oddly deliberate, as though the desk had claimed her slowly and she'd made no argument against it. Her hand, still faintly tremulous with warmth when the ambulance arrived, held the envelope so tightly it took the pathologist's quiet insistence to free it. Unstamped, unaddressed, but sealed, and not with wax or tape, but with a jagged red line that meant someone had bled or wished to give the impression they had. I watched as the envelope was bagged, catalogued, and carried out like a witness who'd already given its statement and would now remain inconveniently silent. Lewis looked to me, as he often does, with that quiet ask in his brow. Suicide, they'd said. Overwork. Mental strain. A history of melancholy if one were kind. A tendency to brood if one were less so. I listened, nodding occasionally, and said none of what I was thinking. The room was too neat. Not in the sense of tidiness. Books were piled where books always pile. Papers spilled across the corner chair, and a scarf had slipped half to the floor. But neat in the sense of arrangement. This was not chaos. This was a composition. There was a draft on the desk, half written, half whispered, titled The Final Voice of Eliza Marr, A Reconsideration. Lines were underlined, entire paragraphs crossed out with that rare ferocity only the deeply literate permit themselves. And there were gaps. Not the lazy sort, but excisions. Someone had taken care to remove certain sentences altogether, leaving behind a ghost of logic that didn't quite hold. I touched the margin. Faint pencil notations lingered, a second hand at work. A collaboration, perhaps. Or a contest. Harriet had been circling back, it seemed, to her original thesis. That Eliza Marr had not died quietly. That the poet's final days, long believed to have been steeped in solitude and laudanum, had instead been marked by betrayal. Academic suicide, they called it when she'd first suggested as much. To accuse a long-dead male poet of theft and then suggest his victim had died to silence it? Oxford didn't appreciate revisionists with ink-stained fingers. Lewis crouched near the desk, looking with the kind of frown he saves for crossword clues that almost work. He said, not quite to me, that the envelope had no flap. I turned toward him, slowly. No flap, he repeated, looked as though it had been sealed from the inside. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Some things hum at a frequency only the guilty and the grieving can hear. I stepped toward the shelf. There, nestled between Browning and Rossetti, was a copy of Marr's collected works. I pulled it gently. A small slip of paper fell, fluttering to the floor like an afterthought. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I read the spine. Collected Works, Annotated Edition, H. Lencomb, editor. I opened it to a random page and read the marginalia. Sparse. Measured, but familiar. I had seen the same hand in the draft on the desk. Outside, the trees had begun to shift with the late wind. The college chapel bell sounded a hollow tone that felt neither reverent nor mournful, simply late. I thought, briefly, of Eliza Marr, whose death had also been neat, whose legacy had, for a time, belonged to others. And now, Harriet Lencomb, her biographer, lay on a cold desk beneath a half-finished article and a blood-sealed envelope with no destination. I stepped back into the corridor. A student passed without looking. Rain was beginning to fall against the stone, each drop a soft note in a composition no one had scored. I turned up my collar. Some envelopes, I thought, are meant to be opened only by the wrong person. There is a particular stillness in academic offices, the kind that accumulates behind stained glass and shelves, groaning under the weight of second editions. Professor Roland Hensley's rooms were precisely the sort one expects from a man who prefers his sentences long and his pupils brief. The air smelt of dry leather and oversteeped tea. A Keats bust presided from the mantel with faint disdain. He motioned to a chair but remained standing, as if the act of sitting in his own office might encourage familiarity. He asked, with polite apathy, whether the matter would take long. I replied that time often behaves strangely around the dead. He smiled, though not with his eyes, and turned to straighten a book that had needed straightening. He spoke of Harriet Lencomb as one might speak of a former student who had read too much into everything, bright, undoubtedly. Troubled, perhaps. She had, he said, a tendency to become infatuated with secrets, a romantic disposition poorly suited to footnotes. And then, as if remembering the correct emotion, he added that her death was very tragic, of course, very sad. On his desk lay an early draft of his forthcoming monograph, Keats and the Myth of Endings. The title was underlined. Twice. I asked if he'd read Harriet's recent paper on Eliza Marr's marginalia. He hesitated, just briefly, before replying that it hadn't crossed his desk. She was veering into speculation, he believed, a kind of literary necromancy. His phrase, not mine. I set the evidence bag containing the envelope on the desk beside him. Just a moment, just enough to watch his hand falter as it reached for a pen. It wasn't dramatic, not even perceptible, perhaps, to someone unpracticed in quiet choreography. But his fingers curved inwards, ever so slightly as though preparing to withdraw from something hot. He recovered, asked whether it had been posted. I said no. He nodded, eyes already retreating to the manuscript as if poetry might explain away coincidence. Later that afternoon, I found myself wandering toward the library. Not for evidence, not yet, but for tone. The Oxford Library has a peculiar hum, not the silence of absence, but the silence of pages breathing just beneath the skin. Harriet had worked here, written here, likely dreamt here. The ghosts of romantic poets hung thick in the air. Not the poets themselves, of course, but their adjectives. Cordelia Vane was seated at the long table beneath the mezzanine, her fingers resting idly on a closed volume. She wore a scarf the color of rusted copper and looked out of place among the soft plastic bindings and tired undergraduates. She had been Harriet's closest friend, once the wife of a noted philologist, now the widow of a man she referred to, with neither affection nor disdain, as a man who had always been far better on paper. She asked whether Harriet had suffered. I told her that we didn't yet know. She nodded, then added that Harriet had often said she'd die with a secret between her teeth. I asked what that secret might have been. She looked past me, past the shelves, past everything, and said, perhaps the one she never told me. A laugh, too loud for the setting, rang out from the next aisle. Young, male, possibly nervous. Cordelia's face didn't change. I stood, curious, and stepped between the stacks. A trail of displaced books and a backpack slouched against the radiator marked the graduate students passing. The aisle was empty now, but there, perched oddly atop a row of theology journals, was a book out of place. Letters from the Hollow Muse, a slim collection, not one I'd known Harriet to cite. I turned it over, then opened to the center. The margins bled red. Notes scribbled with intensity, the ink flaring in places as if the hand had pressed harder than needed. One phrase had been underlined twice. No voice is truly lost if it echoes in the wrong ears. I didn't take the book. I let it remain where it had been left. Perhaps intentionally, perhaps not. As I walked back to the light filtering through the front windows, I thought again of Hensley's tremble, Cordelia's gaze, and the way laughter in libraries always seems a little cruel. There is something impolite about joy in the presence of the unread. There's something oddly consoling about footnotes. They exist in the margins, half-whispered, deferential. The polite coughs of scholarship, too timid for the main text, but too insistent to be left unsaid. I've always read them first. There's a kind of honesty in the detour. Harriet's manuscript, unfinished, unloved, and unlikely to see print now, was heavily marked, but only one annotation had been circled. Not once, but twice. A footnote on page 37, referring, with cautious italics, to a sealed letter, believed destroyed in 1871. No source, no explanation, just that, sealed, destroyed. And beneath the line, faint pencil initials that weren't Harriet's, or perhaps they were. People often write differently when they're not writing for anyone. The letter in question belonged, allegedly, to Eliza Marr, poet, recluse, casualty, or at least that's how the record told it. Harriet had argued, to little academic reward, that the record was wrong. She suggested Marr had left behind not just verse, but vengeance. That the letter, whispered about in biographical fragments and misspelled memoirs, had contained a name, a betrayal, possibly both. That afternoon I walked to the Bodleian. The air had turned from drizzle to that thin, persistent sort of rain that soaks without effort. My coat, inadequate as always, surrendered quickly. The stone steps were slick underfoot and smelled faintly of mildew and ink. Inside, the reading room flickered under the usual hush, broken only by the occasional throat-clearing of a man trying to remind the room of his presence. The special collections desk was manned by a young librarian with nervous elbows and the sort of gaze that oscillates between boredom and alarm. When I asked about Harriet Lencombe's archive access, he blinked twice and then, slowly, nodded. Yes, she'd been in. Friday last. Reserved an hour with the sealed archive on 19th century literary correspondence. The Eliza Marr file, specifically. I asked whether she'd found anything. He said nothing for a moment, then added that she had cried. Not dramatically. There had been no sobbing, no theater. Just a stillness, and then tears. He'd looked away. Most people do when truth leaks so quietly. I didn't ask what she had read. Not because I wasn't curious. I was. But because sometimes knowledge behaves like quicksand. Harriet had requested the materials under her own name, and she had stayed exactly 52 minutes. The file was returned with nothing missing. No requests for photocopies. No notes left behind. I thanked the librarian, who shrugged as if absolving himself of significance, and turned to leave. My shoes creaked on the parquet. A nun passed me in the corridor, carrying a plastic bag from Marks and Spencer. She nodded solemnly, as though we shared a secret we hadn't yet discovered. Back in my flat, I poured a glass of whiskey and spread the pages of Harriet's manuscript across the floor like a map to a country that no longer existed. There, again, the footnote. Sealed letter believed destroyed in 1871. The phrasing struck me. Not missing, not lost, believed destroyed. A soft assertion, cowardly almost, or perhaps just careful. The envelope came back to mind, unbidden, unstamped, blood-sealed, no flap, an inversion, not an enclosure. I found myself staring at it again in the evidence file. Still unremarkable in appearance, and yet increasingly the epicenter of something unspeakably personal. Harriet hadn't written it, not exactly. She had performed it, a metaphor rendered in bodily ink. There's a kind of madness that lives at the edges of language, when you've read too deeply, lingered too long in the cadences of the dead. I wondered whether Harriet, for all her precision, had simply slipped beneath the weight of another woman's silence. Ma's letter, whether it had ever truly existed, was no longer the point. It had become a kind of permission. Outside, the rain intensified. The windows rattled gently in their frames. I poured another inch of whiskey and lit a match with more ceremony than needed. There are women who vanish into footnotes and others who write their names in margins. Harriet, I now suspected, had tried to do both, and someone, somewhere, had read her too closely. There are nights that stretch, not with purpose, but with a kind of quiet ache, like a phrase, left unresolved in the final bar of a symphony. I let the Wagner play out from the record's soft hiss, the aria rising imperfectly from the battered speaker. Tristan und Isolde, of course. Always Tristan when I couldn't sleep, which was often. The claret was poor, French in the legal sense, but no further, and I drank it anyway, out of habit rather than desire. The glass was the last clean one, or at least clean enough to pass in low light. Outside, Oxford had folded in on itself. The lanes damp with the hush of closing doors, bicycles chained like arrested thoughts, and puddles gathering without consequence beneath gaslit arches. I picked up the Ma collection again, the edition Harriet had used. There was a page I'd marked earlier, but forgotten why. The corner turned down more in anticipation than insight. The poem was titled A Theory of Absence, and I found the line with a weight that hadn't been there before. The ink that spills from grief is darker than blood. I read it again, and then once more, this time aloud, to the silence that didn't flinch. It was an overwrought line by most standards, but it had lingered. Harriet had quoted it, not in her manuscript, but in an earlier footnote, years back, one of those annotations written more for herself than for peer review. I remembered thinking it too theatrical then. I thought differently now. It was nearing midnight when I rang Lewis. He answered with the soft grogginess of a man who'd left his body beneath the sheets, but not yet managed to return to it. I told him I needed a name, Harriet Lencombe's thesis examiner 10 years back. Preferably before the sun came up, though I knew Lewis would deliver it far sooner. I said the examiner had disagreed with Hensley. Possibly publicly, he asked what he was looking for. I said I didn't know yet. Just that something had been stolen, and someone had noticed. I dressed clumsily in last week's coat and made my way across the quad to the faculty wine cellar. It was nominally closed at that hour, but the door wasn't locked. I stepped inside without ceremony, letting the musty chill embrace me with the familiarity of old regret. A man stood near the back shelf, lean, olive-skinned, with the unconcerned elegance of those who smoke only when thinking and never when asked. He introduced himself in the way the French do, with the impression that the name didn't matter and the accent did. He was, it seemed, temporarily responsible for the university's modest wine archive, part of some trans-European exchange of scholars that Oxford endured in return for brief flirtations with authenticity. He offered me a drink I declined. I asked instead about Harriet. He hesitated, then said he'd only met her twice. Once at a tasting, once more in passing. She had argued, very quietly, very directly, with Hensley. Something about attribution, a lecture perhaps, a phrase, a metaphor. I asked what had been said. He replied that it was in English, but not meant for ewers. She had left early. Hensley had stayed and drank too much. I wandered between the shelves a while longer after the Frenchman had retreated behind his curtain of politeness. I ran my hand across a dusty bottle of Margaux and thought how wine, like scholarship, grows more bitter when mishandled. Back in my flat, I wrote 2 words on the back of an old envelope. March Mirror. Not because I understood them, but because they had begun to repeat in my mind with that strange persistence that precedes either revelation or madness. The mirror, Harriet's mirror, cracked along its diagonal, had seemed incidental at the time, but things are rarely incidental when the dead choose what to leave behind, the ink that spills from grief. I set the poem aside and turned the record over. The aria began again, this time in reverse. Slower, more bruised. Some truths don't announce themselves. They seep. The table stretched like an accusation beneath the hammer-beamed ceiling, polished to a gleam that made the candlelight blur along its surface, as though time itself had left fingerprints. I've never liked high table. The ritual's too brittle, the wine too polite. But that evening I accepted the invitation without protest. There's a particular kind of truth, I've found, that only reveals itself over second courses and false toasts. Professor Roland Hensley sat opposite, haloed faintly by the brass wall sconce and the attention of the younger dons, who regarded him with a studied adoration of men who quote before they read. His hair, once blonde, now bleached to something like frost, had been trimmed too recently, the line at his neck still sharp. He wore academic gown and smugness with equal comfort. Cordelia Vane was 2 places down. She wore something dark and soft at the throat, as though shielding something too tender to be left exposed. She hadn't touched her bread. She rarely did. The soup had been removed. A duck leg arrived, limp in its juice. Conversation skittered across Latin and lecture strikes. I listened, half present, swirling a claret that tasted faintly of libraries and compromise. It was during the port, that sacrosanct final lull before dessert, when bellies are warm and guard slips quietly, that Hensley stood to speak. The toast was for a retiring librarian, but the words were for himself. He began well enough, invoking gratitude and memory with the subtle arrogance of a man who assumes he is both. But then, as he rounded toward his final sentence, he smiled and said, "Love, like a borrowed book, forgets who first held it, but never where it was last left." He paused, pleased. There was a polite murmur, and I, at the far end of the table, stared down into my glass and frowned. Not Shelley. March Eliza Marr, from her 1849 sonnet, last volume. Obscure, yes, but unmistakably hers. A line Harriet had once annotated with the word witness, underlined twice. I looked up. Hensley had resumed his seat. His eyes flickered past me and settled on his wine. Cordelia noticed. She saw the narrowing of my gaze, the tilt of my head. She watched Hensley smile again, faintly, and then turned away. Within 2 minutes, she had excused herself, claiming a headache, though I suspected it had arrived mid-toast. Later, as the hall emptied and cloaks were retrieved, I found Hensley alone in the passage near the portrait of Lord Exeter, the one that always seems to watch with judgment but no opinion. He was fiddling with the clasp of his scarf. I said the quote was lovely. He thanked me. I said I hadn't known Shelley had written it. He blinked once, the pause so brief it might have been a breath. Then said, "A slip of the tongue, perhaps. Meant to say someone else. Marr, wasn't it?" I nodded. "She's easily mistaken," I said, "especially when footnoted." He smiled again, but slower this time. A touch of cold in it. He adjusted his scarf and walked past me, his shoes too loud against the flagstone. I remained in the hallway long after the echo of him had faded. The smell of roast duck and musty velvet lingered in the air like a memory no one wanted. Somewhere above, a window had been left ajar, and the rain made a soft ticking on the stone sill, as though reminding the building it was autumn. I thought of Harriet, seated perhaps at this same table months before, hearing him recite her line, a line he had read in her thesis or borrowed without the borrowing, and saying nothing. Not then, but filing it, shelving it, preparing, as she always did, to prove rather than accuse. In that moment, I didn't yet know what her proof had looked like, but I suspected it came sealed, unstamped, and written in a different sort of ink. I left by the side gate, under the arch, where the lamplight never quite reaches the ground. The street was slick and silent, and in the silence I could almost hear her voice. Not speaking, not accusing, but simply refusing to be misquoted again. There's a kind of intimacy in emails. Not the content, which is often cowardly, but the rhythm, the punctuation. You can read a person's fear in the way they dodge a full stop or hesitate before an ellipsis. Lewis brought me a printed list that morning, rain still dripping from the sleeve of his coat, Harriet, and an unnamed academic blog contributor, stretching back 6 months. No formal greeting, no sign-off, just lines, like thoughts overheard. It wasn't the content that stopped me. It was the shape, the way questions curved inward, the way emphasis sat on unlikely words. The voice, if you can call it that, was restrained but inwardly amused. It wasn't Harriet, but it was familiar. Cordelia, not provable, not yet, but unmistakable, if you knew how she spoke when she wasn't trying to be heard. I found her that evening at the Swan and Rose. Not by arrangement, but by instinct. She preferred its privacy, tucked between a shuttered tailor's and a violin repair shop, both of which had been closed so long they had become part of the wallpaper. The pub was nearly empty. A man with a crossword was nursing a Guinness beneath the window. A couple muttered over crisps, and Cordelia, in her usual seat, one hand resting on the stem of a glass she hadn't touched. She greeted me without surprise, said I looked as though I'd come to accuse her of something beautiful. I said I'd read the blog. Not all of it. Enough to recognize the timbre, the mischief, the ache that hides beneath cleverness. She didn't flinch. She said she never signed it. I said I never asked her to. She sipped her wine then. Finally. Burgundy, or something near enough. I waited. She said Harriet had needed a mirror, not a mentor, that she spent too long looking outward, hoping someone would hand her permission to see herself. She said the archive had changed Harriet, or rather, confirmed something she'd already feared. That the past was not asleep, only silenced. I asked if Harriet had told her what she'd found. She looked down at the table's worn grain and traced a finger along the knot in the wood. She said Harriet had started sleeping less, writing more. She said Harriet had begun to whisper aloud when she worked, not names, but rhythms, as though someone else's cadence had entered her bloodstream. She didn't deny the block, said it was safer that way, to speak without being looked at. I asked her what Harriet had been afraid of. She smiled then, gently, with something closer to regret than secrecy. She said, perhaps it wasn't a person. Perhaps it was an idea, that once you write the truth, you have to decide whether you're willing to live with what comes next. Not everyone is. Outside, the rain had thickened, made syrupy by the low pub light and the yellow reflections from the street. I watched it trail down the window beside her face, warping her expression into something less readable. She said a curious thing as we stood to leave. She said, she sealed it herself, you know, out of habit. She always sealed things that mattered. It caught me off guard, not for what it revealed, but for how precisely it confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. The blood on the envelope, not a message, but a gesture, a signature, something rehearsed, perhaps even ritual. The kind of thing you do when you believe the words inside won't be enough on their own. Cordelia paused at the doorway, one gloved hand on the frame. She said she hoped whatever I was looking for would be worth what I'd have to carry once I found it. Then she stepped into the rain, umbrella unopened, and vanished down the narrow street behind the old post office, the one with the peeling sign no one had painted in years. I sat a while longer, alone now. The crossword man had gone. The couple, too. Only the empty glass remained, a fingerprint pressed just beneath the rim, red wine and silence. I traced the shape of it and thought, not for the first time, how rarely we understand what we've sealed until it's already been opened. It had the stillness of a place abandoned without sorrow, not quite untouched, but unbothered, the way flats become when their occupants never fully lived in them, only visited now and then with polite intentions. Harriet's flat was on the top floor of a converted terrace near St. John Street, the sort of building whose Georgian bones showed through every ill-chosen lampshade. Lewis moved quietly through the sitting room, as though fearing the furniture might bruise. He opened drawers, flicked through paperbacks with detached curiosity. I let him work. My own attention had drifted to the mantel, where a single brass candlestick leaned slightly out of true. There were no photographs, just a scattering of handwritten index cards, none of them labeled. The desk, narrow, scarred, littered with drafts, stood beneath the window, which looked out over the back of a chapel that had long since ceased to believe in much. The air was faintly sweet with the ghost of lilies, though no flowers remained. On the desk was a manuscript, typed and annotated, its title page faintly smudged by a coffee cup. Blood authorship and the feminine voice, a subject Harriet had circled for years without quite naming. I skimmed the first page. Academic, yes, but restless, as though each sentence were trying to outrun its own footnote. Lewis asked what it was. I said, a confession, perhaps, or a map. I turned to a section midway through. The margins were marked with a different pen, heavier, darker, more certain. The passage read, "To write one's own death is not to seek it, but to own it, to claim authorship of silence before it is assigned by someone else's hand." I stared at the line for a long moment, then looked up. The desk had a mirror propped against its back panel. Oval, unframed, cracked diagonally like a wound that refused to finish healing, it reflected part of the room, the leg of the desk, the edge of the wall, and something else. I bent lower. Beneath the desk, almost invisible against the wood grain, was the corner of a folded paper, taped there with a kind of discretion that implies importance, but not desperation. I reached for it. The tape peeled slowly, soundlessly. Lewis watched me unfold it. His face said nothing, though I knew he wanted to ask. The paper was old, but not old enough. Cream stock, ink that bled faintly at the serifs. The language was Mars, or meant to be, florid and injured and precise. But it was Harriet's work, her structure, her fingerprints in the literary sense. It was a forgery, but not in malice, a reconstruction, a facsimile of a thing that might have existed, designed not to deceive, but to provoke. The letter bore a name. Not Mars, not the recipients, but a single line quoted from one of Hensley's published lectures, a line Ma had never written, a line that Harriet had buried here within the voice of the woman he'd once stolen it from. I handed the paper to Lewis. He held it like a priest might handle a false relic. Reverent, uncertain. I asked what date was printed in the header. He read it aloud. 3 weeks before she died, which left the real question unasked, but louder for it. Why didn't she publish it? Lewis shrugged, said maybe she lost her nerve, or her belief in what it might change. Maybe she thought the truth, once exposed, would simply disappear into polite embarrassment. I said nothing, because I didn't believe that was it. Harriet had never lacked for courage, only timing. I stood, suddenly aware of how dark the flat had become. The sky outside had thickened into something vaguely ecclesiastical. Bells began to ring across the city. Not in mourning, not in celebration, just in habit. I looked once more at the cracked mirror. The split line bisected my face. I didn't flinch. Some forgeries are truer than the originals. Some letters are written to be read only after the wrong people have seen them. And some mirrors, the kind without silver or truth, show not your reflection, but your intentions. I folded the paper again, slipped it into a folder without label. We left without touching anything else. There was nothing left to disturb, only the silence and the ink. There is a kind of silence that arrives not after revelation, but just before, the hush not of aftermath, but of alignment. I remember it clearly. The evening was still, windless, with a ceiling of clouds so low it made the chimneys of North Oxford appear truncated, like pencils snapped at the neck. I'd poured no whiskey. I needed the weight of the moment to arrive unclouded. The envelope had sat untouched for days, though I'd visited it often in thought. That strange choreography between impulse and restraint. I set it beneath my desk lamp and watched the edges blur slightly in the golden light. There it was again, the thing that had bothered me from the start. Not the blood, not the lack of stamp, but something subtler, something tactile. I turned it over slowly and ran my fingers across the back, letting my eyes lose their precision so the shape might emerge without expectation. There, near the upper left corner, a shallow curve, half-formed. A pressure mark, like the ghost of a thumbprint. It had not been pressed shut by accident. It had been sealed with intention, but not sent, which meant it was not meant for the authorities. Not for Hensley either. He would not have recognized the gesture. No, it was meant for someone who understood staging, timing, the rhythm of unveiling, Cordelia. I opened the envelope slowly, not out of reverence, but out of reluctance. Inside, a single sheet of creamy stock, folded twice and written in Harriet's hand. The same hand I'd seen scrawling the margins of her manuscript, precise but almost theatrical in its restraint. I read it once, then again, and then let it rest against the desk like something still breathing. She had not written a confession, not in the legal sense. What she had composed was a cue. She wrote of authorship, not of prose, but of moments. She spoke of her death not as end, but as composition. She described the desk, the blood, the envelope, all as part of a performed truth. Not suicide, not quite, but theatre, a tableau, a scholar's indictment dressed in tragedy's robes, a curtain call for a plagiarist. To frame a thief, she wrote, one must first make him an audience. The blood, she explained, though delicately, almost apologetically, was her own, yes, but not from violence. Menstrual. Chosen. The details struck me like a footnote with too much weight, private, irreversible, and entirely deliberate. She'd written of the historical silencing of women's voices, and now of using her body as instrument, her silence as proof. The envelope was never meant to expose the crime directly. It was meant to summon the moment, to implicate not through accusation, but through consequence. Harriet had expected the scene to be found by Cordelia. She had expected a conversation, a gasp, perhaps even applause. What she had not expected was interference, but I had begun to. The staging was too precise, the absence of struggle too arranged. And the timeline, the envelope sealed, the mirror cracked, the manuscript unfinished. All of it suggested rehearsal, not rupture. Someone had arrived before Cordelia. Someone who had understood, if not the content, then the threat. I sat back in my chair and stared at the paper. The words did not blur, they clarified. This was not a suicide. This was not a cry for help. It was a final paragraph waiting for punctuation. And someone, I now suspected who, had decided to end the sentence with a full stop instead of a question mark. Outside, the street lamps hummed faintly against the mist. The city breathed on without noticing. I thought of Harriet's performance. Bold, silent, precise. And how close she'd come to being misunderstood entirely. In the end, she hadn't sought martyrdom. She'd sought recognition. She'd written herself a stage, drawn the curtain, and waited, not for justice, but for someone to understand the language. She had waited for applause, and someone else had answered with silence, permanent, irreversible, and cruelly on cue. I've always preferred museums in the afternoon, not for the light, which fades too quickly in English winters, but for the absence. The hush between school groups and closing time. The echo of footsteps that don't know if they're allowed. A place pretending to preserve the past, while quietly confessing it cannot. I asked Hensley to meet me in the Ashmolean, casually, without explanation. He agreed with a swiftness that almost disappointed me. He wore his usual navy coat, buttoned too high for comfort, and carried a folded umbrella that hadn't been necessary in 3 days. We wandered in near the Egyptian wing before I gently diverted us toward the temporary exhibition, Ma and the Margins, Women of the Romantic Fragment. He hadn't seen it, or claimed not to. The gallery was nearly empty. A docent drifted at the far end, pretending not to listen. Dust filtered through the skylight in slow suspension, the color of parchment and ash. We passed etchings, letters, a daguerreotype of a woman believed to be Ma, all curation and uncertainty. Hensley moved quickly, as though afraid to stop long enough for any image to attach itself. Then we reached it. Not the centerpiece, but the corner. A faded landscape. Nothing special. A country road dissolving into evening fog. Brush strokes so timid they barely arrived. Beneath it, a placard. A quote. Love, like a borrowed book, forgets who first held it, but never where it was last left. Hensley read it. I watched him read it. And I saw the smallest betrayal, not in his face, which remained still, but in his hand. It twitched once, then pressed deeper into his coat pocket, as though searching for something that wasn't there. I said it was a lovely line, he agreed. I said it was not Shelley. He smiled, too tightly. Said attribution had always been a slippery art. I let the silence sit a while, let the painting hum its nothingness into the corners. Then I asked if he remembered Harriet's envelope. He said he did. I asked if he'd opened it. He said he hadn't. I said that was wise, because what lay inside wasn't meant for him, but what it revealed, or tried to, was his work, or rather, the absence of it. He turned to face me fully then, his expression unreadable, save for the eyes. Not guilty, not afraid, just tired. I told him about the forged letter, the one Harriet had reconstructed. I told him it was dated, filed, and hidden, and that it included a phrase from one of his lectures, one that didn't belong to him, one that belonged to Ma, or rather, to Harriet. He said nothing. I told him the real twist wasn't in the forgery. It was in the original, or what had passed for original all these years. A letter long believed lost, once cited in an obscure monograph published under a pseudonym. The handwriting, I said, matched an early draft of his DPHIL thesis. An unattributed quote, a stolen voice. He looked at me then, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet recognition, as though the truth had already arrived and he had merely been waiting for it to speak aloud. I asked why. He shrugged, said sometimes one borrows more than books. We stood there for a long while. People moved past us, but slowly, as if we were part of the display. Eventually, he asked if he might finish the exhibition. I said yes, and I watched him walk on, coat still buttoned too high, umbrella still folded, silence clinging to his shoulders like a well-cut regret. The docent smiled as I passed her. I returned it, faintly. Outside, the light had begun to yellow, the kind of gold that flatters truth without forgiving it. I lit a cigarette I didn't finish, and thought about Harriet, not in death, but in rehearsal, the way she'd set her stage, the way she'd waited, not for justice, but for someone to know, and someone in the end had. The flat was quiet in that late-hour way that feels earned. No cars, no bells, only the subtle creak of a building settling into its bones. I hadn't drawn the curtains. The city was folded in darkness, windowless and secretive, like a manuscript in a language too delicate to read by day. The envelope lay open on my desk. Unsealed now, the flap relaxed like the mouth of someone who's just finished speaking. Inside, a photocopy for the Crown, a digital scan for the file. The original would be catalogued, labeled, buried. But it was the paper itself, the real one, that I'd kept nearby, resting against the edge of a forgotten book of verse, not quite touching it. I'd read it so many times by now that the cadence of it had become second nature. Harriet's handwriting, sharp, unhurried, curled into the page with neither apology nor excess. She hadn't written for posterity. She'd written for someone who would recognize the tempo. There is something deeply personal about ink. The way it bleeds, the pressure of the hand, the space between the lines. It reveals far more than the words themselves. In Harriet's case, it was defiance, held in a kind of fragile grace, as if she knew the story wouldn't end in her favor, but had insisted on telling it anyway. I reached for the glass of wine I'd poured an hour ago and hadn't touched. Claret again, unimpressive but sufficient. The sort of drink that asks no questions and leaves no answers. I drank it in silence, the kind that doesn't settle but waits. The stereo clicked faintly as it warmed. I let Maria Callas fill the room, her voice rising into that almost breaking clarity she held like a blade. Visidat. I had no faith left in opera, but the sound still undid me. The final high note trembled, just slightly. Not in weakness, but in memory. It wasn't perfect, which is why it mattered. A small white envelope arrived earlier that day. No return address. Just my name, hand-inked in a hand I recognized immediately. Cordelia. She'd sent no flourish, no apology, only one sentence, written cleanly on a page that smelled faintly of lavender and distance. She wanted you to see it first. I folded it once, then twice, and slipped it between the pages of letters from the hollow muse. Somewhere between Ma and Harriet, the note would rest, unread by the right people and unreadable by the wrong ones. I thought of Harriet alone in her flat, the mirror cracked diagonally, the envelope placed with precision on her desk. Not with despair, not even with certainty, but with hope. The kind not meant for resolution, only recognition. She hadn't expected applause, only understanding. A reader. The act of writing, truly writing, is a form of confession too subtle for courtrooms. She had placed herself in a lineage of women whose voices were always found posthumously, if at all. Eliza Marr, the others, the ones who wrote themselves into existence before someone else could write them out. Hensley had reassigned her sentence, had footnoted her name into someone else's victory, but Harriet had written it back. And yet, even that isn't quite the truth, because the letter wasn't accusation, it wasn't vindication either. It was staging, it was theater, it was a final paragraph, offered like an aria that might never be performed. The pigeon arrived just after midnight, dull grey as pigeons always are, but with a slight mark of russet at the nape, like a rusted medal. It landed on the windowsill, tilted its head once, then looked in. I did nothing. After a few seconds, it flew away. No drama, no message, only departure. I watched the window for a while longer. No one else came. Some letters, I suppose, were never meant to be posted, only opened. Read understood, if possible, and then left behind.